We have already gone over how to do our cast on for this project. We've learned to do our knit stitch and knit every stitch of every row, which produces the garter stitch fabric. And right now I'm going to show you how to do the purl stitch. And that is what is going to create the fabric that you see right here. Now, a question that I get asked a lot is, how does a knit stitch look different from a purl stitch? And that is a complicated question to answer because the answer is a knit stitch looks identical to a purl stitch from the back, and a purl stitch looks identical to a knit stitch from the back. They are mirror images of each other, and so if you point to one stitch and say, was this stitch knit or purled? I have no idea. What I can tell you is when I look at this fabric, I know that one whole row was knit and then one whole row was purled. Just like if I look at just this fabric, I know that every stitch was knit. So I'm going to show you how to do the purl stitch now, and then you'll know how to create fabric that looks like this as well. When you do create this kind of fabric that you knit an entire row and then purl an entire row, this fabric is going to curl on the edges and on the ends. So if you do an entire scarf done with this kind of stitch, your scarf is going to curl up into a tiny tube. You're not doing anything wrong. That's what that fabric is supposed to do, but it's not what most people want their scarves to look like. So that's why in this scarf pattern, we're only doing it for a fairly small amount of time, and it is less likely to curl. You'll also notice in this particular pattern, you have a little bit of a different looking fabric on the edge. Generally, if you are doing this stockinette stitch fabric on something like a scarf, you're going to do the edge in some kind of a stitch combination that doesn't curl. So on this pattern, the pattern itself is going to tell you to knit the first and the last 4 stitches of every row, even on the rows where you're purling the rest of the time. And that creates this edge that makes it less likely to roll. If you do the entire scarf this way, it will still roll up. Those 4 stitches will lay flat and your whole scarf will still curl up into a tube. But it's going to, for a small piece, it's going to keep things a little bit straighter. So, as a quick review of the knit stitch, we are going to, as the pattern is going to be telling you, you'll be looking at the pattern as well, following along if that's the way that you're going with this. To review the knit stitch, we put our needle in, we wrap our yarn around, we pull that loop through, and we push the loop off into the air. So the pattern is telling us to knit 4 stitches. We are going to knit 4 stitches. And then the pattern is going to tell us to purl to the last 4 stitches. One big trick that needs to happen, the difference when you're getting ready to do a purl stitch, your yarn needs to be in front of your needles. When you're doing a knit stitch, the yarn is in the back. So we've just finished knitting. We need to bring the yarn to the front of our work so that that yarn is in the front to be able to do our purl stitch. And the exact same 4 steps are going to happen for purling that they did for knitting. But the big important part is we have our yarn beginning in the front before we start any of these steps. So step 1, we put our needle in from back to front so that that right hand needle pokes out towards us. Step 2, we're going to bring the yarn up and over that front needle. Step 3, we're going to take that loop that we just laid across and pull it back through the loop on our left needle. And then step 4, that loop on our left needle is going to jump off into the air. We'll do that again. Again, 4 steps to purl, just like the 4 steps to knitting. The only real difference is you're putting your needle in a slightly different way. So step 1, our right hand needle goes in from back to front so that needle pokes out towards us. Step 2, we take our yarn and go up and over. Step 3, we pull that new strand of yarn that we just laid across underneath. And the last step, this loop jumps off into the air. And that is how we do a purl stitch. And so we are going to purl. The pattern tells us how many stitches to purl, or in this case, the pattern tells us to purl until we have 4 stitches remaining at the end. So we're going to purl until we get fairly close over there, And then we're gonna stop and count. We have 4 stitches left, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now the pattern is gonna tell us to knit those last 4. And again, the biggest trick when it's switching between knits and purls is to take your yarn for purling, the yarn is in the front. We're getting ready to knit. We're gonna take our yarn between the 2 needle tips to the back. And we're going to knit those last 4 stitches, just like knitting that we have done before. Knit those last 4 stitches. And this pattern, so the first pattern that we did, the very first step, we did the exact same thing every row. We knit every stitch of every row for the whole project, or for that whole section. This section is made up of 2 different rows. The row that we just completed was our purl row. And if you look at the fabric here, it looks kind of bumpy. It looks like an inside-out sweater, is kind of what I tell people. When we're looking at that fabric, that means we've just completed or are getting ready to start a purl row. So this is the purl side. Most of the time that's referred to as the wrong side, and in patterns, the abbreviation WS for wrong side will be used sometimes. So if it's saying row 1 and in parentheses WS, that means wrong side, and that's the side they're talking about. When we finish that row and flip around to this row, now we are looking at the right side of the fabric. Again, I think it looks like a right side out sweater, like a sweater that you would go buy at the store. And to me, I see the letter V. I see a lot of little letter V's all stacked up on top of each other. This is the knit side of the fabric, the right side, and in patterns, the abbreviation RS for right side will be used. I do think most of us know how to spell wrong side, but when you're in the middle of keeping track of a bunch of other things, it can be confusing because the word wrong sounds like it starts with an R. So when you see RS, remember that is right side, WS is wrong side. It's not telling you to do anything, it's just telling you which way should you be looking at your fabric. And that is how we do the knit stitch at the bottom. Knit every stitch of every row, and then switch between knits and purls for this stockinette stitch fabric.